Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 37th video in our Master Series and the 7th video in our first phase processing. We talked about in the last video about frequency and volume modulations a little bit. There's plenty of videos on my channel about sound and noise and acoustics and waveforms and all kinds of things for you to study. But I was trying to make the concept very simple. Next thing we're going to talk about sample fusion and synth fusion blends. Now this can be kind of a complicated thing because depending on what you're trying to work on, it can be a different application. If you have a synth patch that you're working on that you want to put other synth sounds in conjunction with it and things like that, well, it can become a blending thing to where, it's a little bit more extreme. To where I've got this synth patch here, but I've got this other synthesizer that's either a font synth, an actual synth, or a sample synth, and I start following the texture or the whatever, the passage or the performance, and then trying to render it down and drag it onto the other one and bounce them together. And we showed you about bouncing and just blending them together at different levels, and that can be more extreme. So that is basically more times than not being dealt with when you are creating. So if you're creating, you've got to create some synth patch or combination of sounds, and we're not getting into that right now. There's plenty of other videos on my channel about synthesizer and things like that for you to be creating. What we're talking about is sound sculpting. So this concept normally that when we're sound sculpting, if it's a synth, you've probably already sculpted the sound pretty well. You might fine tune it while we're going through processing or add something to it and things like that. But more than likely, you're pretty happy with it. So we're dealing with, let's take for example that we're dealing with a vocal. Now, this could be a guitar, a bass, or an oboe or whatever. But the concept of you being able to use other synthesizers, font synth synthesizers, or sample synths to add the sound to it. Normally, this is very minuscule. And when I say minuscule, it's just like when I talked about adding noise to a file, that it's very light. I mean, almost imperceivable, that's going to add this texture and body to the sound, or some type of texture that's going to fill it out or give it some kind of flavor that makes it sound really cool. The concept of this is pretty simple. If you're dealing with like font synths, that a font synth you can get like sound fonts. Like here's a few of them that I have that I like. Most of the stuff that I do, that I've found that these ones covered it, and then I do sound sculpting and mixing. I have a multi-instrument thing that I have in my studio that lets me add any sample synths, font synths, and regular synthesizers together to create whatever kind of sound I'm looking for. But like fonts, synth, you can buy fonts or get fonts that you can actually just drag onto a font synth, to where now I've dragged that font on there and I've got a harpsichord all the way across the keyboard. And those are huge tools to help you do that. And you have things like normal synths that are just you're creating from oscillators, and there's a whole series on my channel about synthesizers, so check that out. And those can be done the same way. Or sample synths, if you've got samples somewhere, that if you've got a sample synthesizer and you've got a bunch of samples that, like here, I've got tons of samples here. Any kind of didgeridoo, whatever the heck that I want to put on there, you can drag that sample onto there and have it map it out across the keyboard to where you can follow the notes to do what I'm talking about. So those are some simple tools to do it. But let's say that I've got this simple passage. Now, this simple passage, basically, if I don't normally have the audio set up to listen to it, but on this simple passage that was just the vocals, that this is just the vocals. And I've got it going on there. I want to add some texture to it. So I've added a cello, and a lower end cello, and I press, and it's pretty aggressive. You can really hear the cello mixed in on it. So that's not what we're looking for. What we want to do is we want to add some texture, and this could be any sound. I'm using a vocal as an example, But once I've followed this and I've got out my MIDI keyboard and I've followed the basic texture of what's going on, you basically got to get in there and normally do some work on it so that you know where this thing starts and where this thing ends, you know, that you can see where things are starting and ending, that you'll have to get in there and adjust these. I haven't in this case, but this is starting right here, it's ending there. And I have to go in there and adjust these notes to where they're following things pretty close. And then afterwards, you might have to do some ADSR work and things like that, you know, trying to get those sound, once you've broke it down to being a sound, to get it to match up pretty close and to start and end times where it's going. Sometimes that can be tedious work. Sometimes you get lucky, you just do a good job of it, you just take a little bit of fussing around in your MIDI, and that's normally not that big a deal. Watch that video, on those videos I have on synthesizers, because you can go in and drag MIDI notes around and then render it to audio and then fuss with it a little bit after you make sure you got the start and end times pretty much where you want it. Adjust the ADSRs on them a little bit and some things like that. And for the most part, at that point, you should be able to get done what we're talking about here, because you can take this and you can actually take this file on this synth, this font synth that I was using, transform it to audio, and once you've got to audio, you can loop it around on there. So you can actually loop that on there and then just slowly, normally that the key issue that people lose on this, that they don't really understand, it's like the concept of us adding noise when we were talking about in the first video of sound sculpting, of how it can be look like this. The sound file will actually look like this. You'll have it turned down so bad that so low you don't even see anything on there. But it's just ever so slightly that just adds texture or some kind of flavor to it. It might be an oboe, it might be a didgeridoo, it might be who knows what. It might be a synth patch that's adding a little bit of dirt or some smoothness with a mixture of triangle waves and sawtooth waves or whatever that's just going to add this flavor to it. You can normally turn it up and loop it and listen to it and hear the type of texture it's going to have working in conjunction with it. You just don't want it to sound like. You don't want the vocal to sound like there's a cello playing with it. You want to add the characteristics of the cello to that voice, which basically means you want to follow the same notes, but you want to add that smooth cello flavor and that kind of feeling ever so slightly into it, like your sound sculpting, like we talked about in the first sound sculpting video, that you're adding harmonics, you're adding saturations, you're adding noise, you know, to the sound to make it sound better. And so you might get it down to where it's just like way down there to where you can't hardly even see it. And you sit there, A-B it back and forth, listen to it with it, listen to it without it, listen to it with it, listen without it. And most of the time, you won't actually hear no kind of cello going on back there. I mean, there isn't any kind of, you are not going to perceive that there's a cello behind that vocalist or behind, you know, like a choir section or you know, you've got a chorus on a song and the whole band's going, and then I go, you know, and then then the verse starts in. But you want to add some flavor to it to smooth it up a little bit with some cellos or some kind of synth patch or something to give it some kind of texture or flavor, that most of the time that you just kind of want to blend it in there, that you don't really hear the cello or whatever synth patch or sample or whatever you had put on there. You just want it to add this flavor to it to make it sound better, to make it sound just like you're doing in that first sound sculpting video we talked about. You're adding harmonic content to it, saturation and distortion and noise to it that makes it sound better. So you have to basically break down to whatever sample that you're using, whatever synth or font synth or sample synth that you're using, those patches or whatever those are, to try to add that to the sound. And they do it well. I mean, for you to recreate, you know, a cello completely from scratch, trying to get that exact effect with the sound sculpting we talked about in that first video can be very difficult and time consuming. Sometimes things we talked about, and a lot of times they'll do a great job. But sometimes you might want to do something like this. You've got that chorus on this thing, and then the guy's singing, and all of a sudden the whole band goes into chorus. Why not me? You know, and you just want to add this flavor to it, add these harmonics, and add this distortion, saturation, noise from a cello, or a cello, a violin, and a contrabass. That's just going to add this fullness to it. That's going to be this real low end, this mid range, and this high stuff. But you can't even perceive it. There's no way anybody would ever know that there's a contrabass or a cello or a violin behind them, but it sure sounds nice, bro. I mean, their chorus now just sounds wow, and it's just got this body, it's got this frequency range that's just full, and it just sounds awesome. Like you did some serious sound sculpting on those sounds to make them sound awesome. And even just a solo vocalist, you can do that to add monumental amounts of flavor and texture to what's going on that nobody will ever know what you did. They'll never perceive it. They're never going to hear that there's a cello behind there, or you put a contrabass behind it, you know, to do that, or some synth patch, because you wrote it down so low that you're just basically trying to add some of that harmonic content that we talked about, some saturation, some distortion, and some noise that's inherent in that cello, that's going to add this really cool flavor to that vocalist to really make them shine and sound really good. Or some instrument like a guitar on a lead or on a rhythm section or something like that that's going along that can just do some really cool things. So once you've got it to where you know you're happy, that you just transfer it to rendered audio, and then you more than likely are going to have some work to do. Going in there, once you've worked with your MIDI, make sure you've really set up to where things start and where they stop. Then you may have a little bit of ADSR work and things like that, but normally not too much unless there's really problems on the synth. You want to get the sound as close to whatever instrument you're following as possible, but you may have to do some editing to it, you know, like we talked about in editing, to make it, you know, start and stop, where we talked about flow editing on what you've done. So you might have to go back and revisit that a little bit in your sound sculpting adventure, but it's a huge tool. I've had some vocalists that I'll have this vocalist sing something and it's just kind of missing something, and I put a contrabass and a cello and a violin behind her, or just a contrabass and a cello, because the lower end I want to really kind of get her lower end sounding really good, and I'll just follow around her vocal on my keyboard and then do some MIDI editing to make sure things start where they stop, render it, and then go cut the file a few places to make sure that I might have a little ADSR work because of how the vocal is. And you know, it may take some fussing, and sometimes not. Sometimes you mix it so minuscule and so lightly you can't even see the waveform, and you're not going to have to fuss with all those ADRs and all that other stuff, that it's good just the way it is. It's adding this harmonic and content and this fullness, and this, it's kind of filling out the frequency range of her voice, and it just sounds smooth and sweet, and she just sounds phenomenal. You know, it just adds that. It's just like sound sculpting in that first video we talked about. Basically, that's what you're trying to add in there with that preset up as a violin. Does that make sense? Or as a cello, because you know those are created harmonics, saturations, distortions, and noise that you perceive as a cello, that you can use those as sound sculpting tools on any other sound. So get out your synth, make a vocal or a guitar track or a bass track or something, and fuss around with it. They're huge, phenomenal tools to really help you sound sculpt. Peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed this video on sample fusion and synth fusion, and I'll see you in the next video.